Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Firstly, I would like to thank to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala that has given everything. Secondly, salawat and salam also delivered to our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has guided us from darkness into brightness. My name is Gustiara Adisty, and I will explain about styles of educational research, Part 9, surveys, longitudinal, cross-sectional, and trend studies. Please enjoy the video. We deal here with several types of descriptive survey research, including longitudinal, cross-sectional, and trend or prediction studies. This chapter should be read in conjunction with the chapters on sampling, questionnaires, interviews, and data analysis techniques. Longitudinal study is an important type of research. Collectively, longitudinal, cross-sectional, and trend or prediction studies are sometimes termed developmental research because they are concerned both to describe what the present relationships are among variables in a given situation and to account for changes occurring in those relationships over time. A survey has several characteristics and several claimed attractions. Typically, it is used to scan a wide field of issues, populations, and programs in order to measure or describe any generalized features. Examples of surveys are as follows. 1. Opinion polls, which refute the notion that only opinion polls can catch opinions. 2. Test scores, the results of testing students nationally or locally. 3. Students' preferences for particular courses, humanities, sciences. And 4. Reading surveys, example of teaching practices in the United Kingdom. Surveys in education often use test results, self-completion questionnaires, and attitude scales. Surveys can be exploratory, in which no assumptions or models are postulated, and in which relationships and patterns are explored. For example, through correlation, regression, stepwise regression, and factor analysis. They can also be confirmatory, in which a model, causal relationships, or hypothesis is tested. Surveys can be descriptive or analytic. For example, to examine relationships, most surveys will combine nominal data on participants' backgrounds and relevant personal details with other scales. For example, attitude scales, data from ordinal, interval, and ratio measures. Surveys are useful for gathering factual information, data on attitudes and preferences, beliefs and predictions, behavior and experiences, both past and present. Some preliminary considerations. The first one is the purpose of the inquiry. First, a survey's general purpose must be translated into a specific central aim. The second phase of the planning involves the identification and itemizing of subsidiary topics that relate to its central purpose. The third phase follows the identification and itemization of subsidiary topics and involves formulating specific information requirements relating to each of these issues. Next is the population upon which the survey is focused. The specification of the population to which the inquiry is addressed affects decisions that researchers must make both about sampling and resources. In this case, the population is readily identifiable and given sufficient resources to contact every member of the designated group. Sampling decisions do not arise. More importantly, in a large survey, researchers usually draw a sample from the population to be studied. Rarely do they attempt to contact every member. And the last one is the resources available. The third important factor in designing and planning a survey is the financial cost. Sample surveys are labor-intensive, the largest single expenditure being the field work, where costs arise out of the interviewing time, travel time, and transport claims of the interviewers themselves. Planning a survey. There are four main considerations in planning a survey. The first one is problem definition, deciding what kinds of contents of answers are required, what hypotheses there are to be tested, what variables there are to explore. Sample selection. What is the target population? How can access and representativeness be assured? What other samples will need to be drawn for the purpose of comparison? Design of measurements. What will be measured and how will be used? What variables will be required? How reliability and validity will be assured? Concern for participants. Protection of confidentiality and anonymity. Avoidance of pain to the respondents. Avoiding harm to those who might be affected by the results, avoiding over-intrusive questions, avoiding coercion, informed consent. A 14-stage process of planning a survey can be considered. Define the objectives, decide the kind of survey required, formulate research questions or hypotheses, the null hypothesis on alternative hypothesis, decide the issues on which to focus, decide the information that is needed to address the issues, decide the sampling required, decide the instrument and the metrics required, generate the data collection instruments, decide how the data will be collected, pilot the instruments and refine them, train the interviewers, collect the data, analyze the data and report the results. Survey sampling. There are two methods of sampling. One yields probability samples in which, as the term implies, the probability of selection of each respondent is known, and the other yields non-probability samples in which the probability of selection is unknown. Probability samples include simple random samples, systematic samples, stratified samples, cluster samples, stage samples, multi-phase samples. Their appeal is to the generalizability of the data that are gathered. Non-probability samples include convenience sampling, quota sampling, dimensional sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling. These kinds of sample do not seek to generalize from the data collected. Each type of sample seeks only to represent itself. The researchers will need to decide the sampling strategy to be used and on the basis of fitness for purpose, in parallel with considerations of, for example, the representativeness of the sample, the desire to generalize, the access to the sample, and the size of the sample. The term longitudinal is used to describe a variety of studies that are conducted over a period of time. Often, as we've seen, the word developmental is employed in connection with longitudinal studies that deal specifically with aspects of human growth. Longitudinal studies can use repeated cross-sectional studies, which are carried out regularly, each time using a largely different sample or a completely new sample, or use the same sample over time. Further, longitudinal studies can combine numerical and qualitative data. For example, a group of young people may be the researcher's particular interest. intending social workers, convicted drug offenders, or university dropouts, for example. And the questions which the researcher will address are likely to include ones such as: is there anything about the previous experience of these individuals that can account for their present situation? A cross-sectional study is one that produces a snapshot of a population at a particular point in time. More typically in education, cross-sectional studies involve indirect measures of the nature and rate of changes in the physical and intellectual development of samples of children drawn from representative age level. The single snapshot of the cross-sectional study provides researchers with data for either a retrospective or a prospective inquiry. Trend studies focus on factors rather than people, and these factors are studied over time. Trend or prediction studies have an obvious importance to educational administrators or planners. Essentially, the trend study examines recorded data to establish patterns of change that have already occurred in order to predict what will be likely to occur in the future. In trend studies, two or more cross-sectional studies are undertaken with identical age groups at more than one point in time in order to make comparisons over time. Trend studies do not include the same respondents over time, so the possibility exists for variation in data due to the different respondents rather than the change in trends. Longitudinal studies, the strength is they are effective in determining variable patterns over time. They can ensure clear focus and validity. They are very effective in doing research on developmental trends, and they are more powerful than cross-sectional studies. And the weaknesses is they require huge amounts of time. They risk gathering data that is not 100% reliable. They would risk experiencing panel attrition, and they require a large sample size. Cohort studies. The strength is multiple outcomes can be measured for any one exposure. Can look at multiple exposures. Exposure is measured before the onset of disease in prospective cohort studies. Good for measuring rare exposures, for example, among different occupations. Demonstrate direction of causality and can measure incidence and prevalence. And the weaknesses is costly and time consuming, prone to bias due to loss to follow up, prone to confounding. Participants may move between one exposure category. Knowledge of exposure status may bias classification of the outcome, and being in the study may alter participants' behavior. Cross-sectional studies. The strength is relatively quick and easy to conduct. No long periods of follow-up. Data on all variables is only collected once, able to measure prevalence for all factors under investigation, and multiple outcomes and exposures can be studied. And the weaknesses is difficult to determine whether the outcome followed exposure in time or exposure resulted from the outcome, and not suitable for studying rare diseases or diseases with a short duration. As cross-sectional studies measures prevalent rather than incident cases, the data will always reflect determinants of survival as well as etiology, and unable to measure incidence. Postal surveys. Postal surveys can reach a large number of people. gather data at comparatively low cost and quite quickly, and can give assurances of confidentiality. On the other hand, postal surveys typically suffer from a poor response rate, and because one does not have any information about the non-respondents, one does not know whether the sample is representative of the wider population. Interview surveys. Interview methods of gathering survey data are useful in that the presence of the interviewer can help clarify queries from the respondents and can stimulate the respondent to give full answers to an on-the-spot survey supervisor, rather than an anonymous researcher known through an introductory letter. Interviews are also useful when respondents have problems with reading and writing. Using non-verbal behavior to encourage respondents to participate is also possible. Telephone surveys. Telephone surveys, it is claimed, have the advantage of reducing costs in time and travel. For where a potential respondent is not at home, a callback costs only a few coins and the time to radio. On the other hand, not everyone has a telephone. The poor, the young, the less educated, and this may lead to a skewed sample. Telephone interviewing has its own strengths and weaknesses. For example, more often than not, a respondent's sex will be clear from their voice, so particular questions may be inappropriate. There are several possible ways of increasing response rates to mail surveys. 1. Arranging follow-ups and polite reminders. 2. Sending advance notification of the survey. 3. Supplying prepaid return stamp address envelopes. 4. Acknowledging institutional affiliation, survey sponsorship, or support from a high-status agent. And 5. Offering financial incentives. It is important to consider why respondents may not reply to requests to participate in surveys. 1. The pressure of competing activities on the time of the respondent. 2. Potential embarrassment at their own ignorance if respondents feel unable to answer a question. 3. Ignorance of the topic, no background in the topic. 4. Dislike of the contents or subject matter of the interview. And 5. Fear of possible consequences of the survey to himself or herself or others. On the other hand, potential respondents may be persuaded to participate depending on 1. The status and prestige of the institution or researcher carrying out the research. 2. The perceived benefit of the research. 3. The perceived importance of the topic. 4. Personal interest in the research. And 5. Interest in being interviewed. Event history analysis. Event history analysis suggests that it is possible to consider the dependent variable as predictable within certain time frames for individuals. In event history analysis, the task is to calculate the hazard rate, the probability of a dependent variable occurring to an individual within a specified time frame. Event history analysis also addresses the problem of attrition, as members leave a study over time. Okay, that's all my explanation. Thank you for your attention, and I end it by wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.